The night had a weight that pressed upon the canvas of the command tent, as though the war itself leaned forward to listen, as though the distant thunder of artillery beyond the hedgerows carried not only the crash of shells, but the murmurs of bruised pride and uneasy alliances. Alan Brooke stood beneath the dim swing of a lantern, whose yellow glow trembled with each gust that rolled in from the French countryside, and he felt the exhaustion seep into his bones like cold water through an old trench coat. The war was turning, perhaps decisively, yet victory had begun to sprout barbs that cut those who reached for it. The interplay of nations fighting under one banner, but dreaming in separate colours, was a battle as tense as any fought with rifles or tanks, and Brooke felt himself standing at the centre of that storm. Reports lay scattered on the table before him, ink smudged where his hand had pressed too heavily, but it was not the documents that disturbed him. It was the news carried by a breathless aide, whispered with the caution of someone delivering a message that might set off its own explosion. Patton had spoken, loudly and proudly, of a triumph he claimed as his own, a triumph woven not by American armour this time, but by British persistence and blood, and the mere thought of it festered in Alan Brooke's chest like smoke seeking a spark. Outside, the night was alive with the low rumble of engines repositioning for the next day's push, and even the earth seemed to vibrate with impatience. Brooke felt suspended between admiration for American vigour and frustration with its recklessness, for he understood that alliances were fragile bridges built over deep waters. A careless boast could crack their foundations. The British troops, battered yet steadfast, had fought through marshes and fortified lanes to secure the breakthrough whose echoes were now being reshaped in Patton's booming voice across press briefings and command discussions. Brooke could already foresee the wave of complications such claims would unleash, not only in morale, but in the delicate chess match of wartime diplomacy. And so, he prepared himself for the conversation he knew was inevitable, the one with Winston Churchill, whose presence was as much a force of nature as the weather rolling over Normandy, a man whose emotions ran fierce alongside his strategic brilliance, and whose pride, though often a tool of motivation, could also be a flame needing careful containment. Brooke stepped out into the night and let the cold air settle him, for the moon hung low in a sky mottled with smoke, and the scent of cordite intertwined with the damp sweetness of churned soil. War stripped landscapes and men alike, leaving behind a rawness that revealed truths not always welcome. As he walked across the camp, boots sinking into the soft ground, he thought of the countless men who slept lightly in the fields beyond, their rest fragile under the constant threat of mortar fire. Yet their sacrifices risked being overshadowed by the powerful narrative of one man's ambition. Brooke felt a surge of protective anger in his throat, not for himself but for them, the quiet ghosts who marched forward without need for applause. He feared that if left uncorrected, Patton's declaration would become another stone of imbalance in an already precarious coalition. When he reached Churchill's quarters, the lanterns outside flickered against the canvas, as if warning of the storm within. Brooke paused before entering, steadying his breath, for he knew that Churchill carried the war across his shoulders, as though every decision were etched into his skin. The Prime Minister had an uncanny ability to transform fury into eloquence and despair into iron resolve, yet even he was vulnerable to the sting of perceived disrespect, especially from those whose strategic outlook he did not always trust. Brooke entered quietly, finding Churchill hunched over a map, cigar smoke coiling upward like a spectral ribbon. The room felt thick with contemplation, and for a moment Brooke simply observed the man who bore the weight of an empire while still finding space in his heart for the common soldier. Then, gathering the threads of his composure, Brooke prepared to tell him what had been said, what had been claimed, and what consequences might ripple outward from a single statement uttered by a general whose courage was matched only by his appetite for glory. As Brooke's mind formed the opening lines of what would become a long night's discussion, he felt the enormity of history pressing in, demanding clarity, honesty, and restraint. The tent seemed to shrink around him as though urging him forward, and he sensed that this moment would shape not only the next phase of the war, but the intricate fabric of trust binding the Allied leaders. And within that constriction of time and duty, He realized that he was not merely delivering news, but defending the integrity of those who had fought under the grey sky of northern France while the world watched from afar. Unaware of the delicate negotiations and quiet sacrifices that had made the breakthrough possible, only then did he step deeper into the glow of the lantern and prepare to speak, aware that what Alan Brooke told Churchill in that fragile hour would echo far beyond them, carried by the restless winds of a war still hungry for both heroes and truth. The moment Alan Brooke uttered the words, the air in the tent seemed to tighten, as though the canvas itself drew closer to listen. Churchill did not immediately react. He remained still, the glow of his cigar trembling faintly, its ember pulsing like a signal from a distant front line. Only the slow exhale of smoke betrayed the turbulence building behind his expression. Brooke spoke with the precision of a man used to reporting facts, not inflating them, but beneath his calm tone ran the current of restrained outrage. He explained how the operation, planned in agonizing detail by British command and executed through days of grinding resistance, had been presented to the press as a triumph of American boldness. He recited the phrases that had been attributed to Patton, the words of conquest, the rhetoric of momentum. And as each one landed in the quiet space between them, Churchill's jaw seemed to harden. For a long while, neither man spoke, and the silence grew heavy enough to drown out even the faint thunder of guns far to the east. Churchill finally leaned back in his chair and stared into the map sprawled before him, tracing with his eyes the routes of advance, the contours of rivers, the inked names of towns that had been reduced to rubble. His voice, when it came, was low and reflective, almost mournful. He spoke of the burdens of alliance, the necessity of swallowing pride in the service of victory, and the maddening paradox that sometimes the truth had to be buried beneath diplomacy. But as he continued, a flicker of temper began to reveal itself, a spark of wounded dignity, not for himself, but for the men who wore the British uniform. Brooke knew this pattern well. Churchill's fury always began as philosophy, evolved into passion, and only then hardened into resolve. He watched as the Prime Minister's fingers drummed the table, the rhythm steadying, the anger refining itself into something precise and dangerous. Brooke intervened softly, reminding Churchill that to confront Patton directly would risk widening the rift between London and Washington, a rift the enemy would eagerly exploit. The two men understood the fragility of their partnership with the Americans. It was built not merely on shared goals, but on the delicate management of egos and national pride. For every act of brotherhood on the battlefield, there was a whisper of rivalry in the corridors of power. They had seen it in the debates over strategy, over command hierarchies, over who would be remembered as the architect of victory. Brooke's mind wandered briefly to the soldiers in the field, who cared little for such disputes. To them, victory was measured not in headlines, but in how many of their friends still breathed when the sun rose again. Churchill rose slowly from his chair and crossed to the tent's entrance, lifting the flap to look out over the camp. The night stretched before him, a mosaic of dim lights, the silhouettes of tanks resting like sleeping beasts, the occasional spark from a cook fire, the smell of oil and smoke mingled with the cool damp of the fields. He stood in silence for a long time, and when he finally spoke again, it was almost to himself. He said that history was often written by those who shouted the loudest, but true leadership demanded the strength to let others shout when silence served the greater cause. Brooke understood the meaning hidden beneath those words. Churchill would not retaliate publicly, not now, not while the alliance held the fate of Europe in its grasp. But privately, he would remember. The ledger of the war was not just one of casualties and victories. It was also a record of truths withheld, of credit misplaced, of sacrifices unacknowledged. Brooke felt the weight lift slightly from his chest, replaced by a quieter sorrow. He knew that restraint was often the cruelest duty of command. They were not fighting for applause but for survival, for a peace so distant it sometimes felt mythical. Yet still, the idea that the blood of British soldiers could be eclipsed by another man's vanity gnawed at him. He thought of the letters that would soon be sent home, the mothers and wives who would read about a great American triumph and never know that their sons had been part of the battle that made it possible. In that thought, Brooke felt the ache of injustice deepen, but he steadied himself. There would be time enough, after the war, to set the record straight. For now, he could only ensure that Churchill's composure held firm, that Britain's voice remained measured even when its heart burned with quiet indignation. As dawn began to thin the horizon with pale light, the two men stood together in silence, listening to the distant roar of engines moving toward another day of combat. The alliance would endure, bruised but intact, because it had to. Churchill's hand rested briefly on Brooke's shoulder, a gesture of gratitude, or perhaps understanding. The conversation had changed nothing in the official record, but it had fortified something unseen, a shared commitment to preserve the dignity of those who fought without the need for a claim. When Brooke left the tent, he carried with him the faint scent of tobacco and rain, and the unspoken promise that, when the war ended, truth would find its own voice. If you've been moved by this moment in history, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know where these stories of courage and pride are reaching across the world. The day broke grey and cold, a colourless dawn that seemed to wash the camp of all warmth. Mist crawled low across the fields where the British lines had passed, veiling the scars of war like a shroud pulled gently over the wounded earth. Alan Brooke walked alone among the remnants of the night, the ashes of a fire still faintly warm, the twisted tracks of heavy vehicles, the smell of oil and damp cloth that clung to the air. Every footprint seemed to carry its own story, yet none would find a place in the headlines. He thought of Patton's words, carried across the Atlantic like an echo of thunder, shaping the perception of victory in the eyes of millions. The world, hungry for heroes, had chosen its voice, and it was loud, brash, unapologetic. But history, Brooke knew, was not built upon the noise of men. It was shaped in the silence that followed, in the choices made by those who did not need to announce them. That morning, Brooke's temper was not the blazing kind. It was the quiet fury of discipline. He gathered his notes, maps, and correspondence, preparing for another long day of coordination between commands. Around him, officers moved briskly, their eyes tired but focused, their movements honed by repetition. They greeted him with brief nods, respect mingled with fatigue. Somewhere, a radio crackled, American frequency, speaking of the swift and decisive maneuver that had broken the German line. Brooke closed his eyes for a moment. He could almost hear the ink drying on the reports that would immortalize that phrasing. A subtle theft of narrative that no bullet could avenge. Still, there was work to be done. The war did not pause for wounded pride. By mid-morning, he joined Montgomery at headquarters, a stone farmhouse half destroyed by shelling, but still upright enough to serve as a nerve center. Montgomery, ever meticulous and sharp, had already heard the same rumors and more. His eyes gleamed with restrained irritation when Brooke entered. The two men shared the same burden, to win not just battles, but the struggle for recognition in a world that often misunderstood the British method. Slow, methodical, deliberate, as weakness. Patton's flamboyance had a certain seduction to it. The Americans adored a man who charged forward with his pistols flashing and his rhetoric burning. The British preferred the quiet competence that let results speak for themselves. Yet in this new war of modern propaganda, quietness risked invisibility. As Montgomery and Brooke discussed logistics, reinforcements, and the next phase of the advance, their words carried an undercurrent of unease. Both men understood that public perception was becoming a weapon as powerful as any tank. Commanders were no longer judged solely by victories, but by how those victories were told. And though Brooke had no appetite for publicity, he realized that history's pen might not wait for the truth to arrive. When the meeting ended, he lingered near the window, watching the endless columns of soldiers and trucks threading their way along the muddy road below. The scene was monumental in its simplicity, a living artery of war pulsing toward the horizon. He thought of how those men, if they survived, would one day be told they were merely the supporting cast in someone else's story. The injustice of it hardened something inside him. Later that day, as reports came in from the field, Brooke wrote a letter to Churchill summarizing the situation. His words were clinical, precise, devoid of emotion. But between the lines ran an unspoken message, a reminder that truth mattered, that integrity in war extended beyond tactics and strategy to the very way triumph was recorded. He did not ask Churchill to confront Patton again. That path was closed. Instead, he urged the reinforcement of British achievements through quieter channels, official communiques, speeches that subtly balanced the narrative, reminders to the press of the cooperative effort. Churchill, ever the orator, understood that suggestion immediately. He would wield words as weapons, shaping perception without open conflict. By evening, the mist had lifted, revealing the battered landscape beneath a pale sun. Brooke stood beside a burned-out tank, its steel still radiating faint heat. He placed his hand upon it, as though feeling for a pulse, and thought of the men who had died inside, their names already fading into the machinery of war. Around him, the countryside was littered with fragments of uniforms, letters, photographs, things once cherished and now abandoned. The wind moved softly among them, carrying the smell of smoke and earth. In that moment, Brooke's anger gave way to something deeper, a kind of sorrowful acceptance. Perhaps, he thought, wars were never truly about who received credit. Perhaps they were about endurance, about how long a man could stand upright beneath the weight of misunderstanding and still do what must be done. That night, as he prepared to rest, he reread the reports once more. The American dispatches still glowed with triumph. The British accounts were dry and factual, two histories of the same event, destined to diverge. Brooke felt the ache of fatigue settle behind his eyes. Yet even in his weariness, there was a quiet conviction that the truth would outlast noise. The world might forget the details of who took which bridge or who advanced first across a river, but it would remember the tone of those who led with integrity. In that faith, he found a fragile peace. Outside, the stars returned, cold and distant. Somewhere in the dark, the engines of war murmured on, relentless and eternal. And beneath them, Alan Brooke lay awake, listening to the hum of a world rewriting itself with every heartbeat, knowing that in the great, chaotic story of victory, sometimes silence was the truest form of strength. If you're still with me on this journey into the quiet heart of war, I'd be honored if you subscribe to the channel. It helps these forgotten stories reach those who still believe history deserves its truth. The next phase of the campaign unfolded with brutal rhythm, a grinding advance across the Bocage country, where every field was a trap and every hedgerow a fortress. The rain returned, heavy and persistent, turning roads into rivers of mud and slowing tanks to a crawl. Men trudged forward under the weight of sodden packs, their faces streaked with grime, their boots devoured by the earth itself. Alan Brooke moved between command posts with the composure of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by hardship. Yet beneath that calm exterior, the same question gnawed at him. How many of these men would live to see the truth of what they had achieved? How many would die before the record could be set straight? Reports filtered in, some clear, others distorted by haste and chaos. There were mentions of American breakthroughs, of armoured thrusts that captured ground already softened by British persistence. Each report was like a small knife twisting under the ribs, not because he begrudged his allies their victories, but because he knew how fragile the alliance had become. Every headline that crowned Patton a saviour risked eroding the careful equilibrium Churchill and Brooke had built with such difficulty. The Americans saw themselves as liberators, the British as guardians of endurance. Two visions of the same war, clashing beneath the surface like tectonic plates. Brooke understood that diplomacy was no less treacherous than combat. The enemy had tanks and artillery, but allies could wound with words. One night, while the guns muttered distantly, Brooke stood alone near a cluster of wrecked vehicles at the edge of a captured village. The smell of diesel and rain hung thick in the air, and somewhere nearby, a church bell, shattered and half buried, chimed faintly when the wind touched it. He thought of Patton again. Not the caricature of arrogance, but the man beneath it, restless and driven, obsessed with momentum. There was a certain tragic grandeur in him, Brooke admitted. He fought like a man haunted by history, determined to carve his name deep into its stone. But that same hunger, unchecked, could consume truth itself. Brooke knew that when men fought not only the enemy but for their own immortality, the line between glory and vanity dissolved into smoke. Churchill, for his part, played the longer game. He understood the art of patience, of allowing others their illusions when the greater prize was victory. He spoke in measured tones during press briefings, praising the courage of all Allied forces, weaving unity into his words, even as he bristled inwardly at the distortions spreading across newspapers. To his confidants, he was more candid. He would remark that war was not only fought on battlefields, but also in newsrooms and dinner tables, and that the real test of leadership was knowing when to let a falsehood pass for the sake of the whole. Brooke admired him for that discipline, though it left him weary. The older he grew, the more he realized that truth often needed to wait for peace to be heard. Days passed. The front crept forward, mile by mile. The casualty lists lengthened. Brooke visited a field hospital where rows of men lay under white sheets, stained brown with blood and rain. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow but defiant. One soldier, barely 20, gripped Brooke's hand with surprising strength and whispered that he had heard on the radio about the great American victory. He smiled faintly, perhaps believing it himself, perhaps knowing otherwise. Brooke could not answer. He simply held the young man's hand until the strength left it. That night, the general wrote in his journal that truth was the first casualty of triumph, and that sometimes victory demanded a silence heavier than grief. As August waned, the clouds broke and the sun returned, blazing across the churned fields, as if to remind men of the world beyond war. The Allied lines pushed forward toward the Seine, the German army in retreat, collapsing under the combined assault. There was cause for celebration, yet the air remained thick with unease. At headquarters, officers discussed the next move, how to press advantage, how to divide responsibilities, how to manage egos now sharpened by success. Brooke felt the invisible web tightening again, threads of politics weaving around strategy. He watched as messages arrived from Washington, from Eisenhower's command, from the War Office in London. Each carried its own tone, its own agenda, its own quiet struggle for authorship of victory. Late one evening, Churchill summoned Brooke for another private talk. The tent was quieter this time, the Prime Minister more subdued. He spoke of fatigue, of the weight of alliance, of the endless balancing act between pride and necessity. Brooke listened, his eyes fixed on the small flame of a candle that flickered near the map table. The flame trembled whenever Churchill's hand passed close to it, and in that trembling light, Brooke saw something profound. The fragility of power itself. No man, not even Churchill, could hold the alliance forever without sacrifice. At last, the Prime Minister looked up and said softly that history would sort it out, that in the end, truth had a way of finding its chroniclers. Brooke nodded, though part of him doubted it. History, he thought, did not find its chroniclers. Men like him had to carve it into existence with patience and resolve. When Brooke stepped outside, the night was clear for the first time in weeks. The stars burned sharp and cold, indifferent to the noise of men. Somewhere across that vast sky, Patton was likely awake too, plotting his next thrust, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that his name had already begun to cast long shadows. Brooke drew a slow breath and felt, for the first time, a kind of calm acceptance. The war would end, and the arguments would fade. But what mattered? The endurance, the courage, the sacrifice, would live in those who had seen it, whether their names were remembered or not. He turned toward the dark line of the horizon, where the guns still whispered faintly, and whispered a silent vow to the men whose deeds had been stolen by pride, that he would remember them, even if history would not. The summer bled into autumn, and the air grew heavier with smoke and expectation. The Allied armies rolled eastward, chasing the enemy across a Europe that was beginning to awaken from its long nightmare. Cities emerged from ruin like ghosts stepping out of the fog, their walls torn open, their windows hollow and unblinking. Everywhere Alan Brooke went, he saw faces. French farmers staring from doorways, children clutching tin cups, women waving tired flags. And in their eyes flickered gratitude, confusion, and exhaustion all at once. Liberation was never as clean as the newspapers would write it. It carried the weight of betrayal, the memory of years lived under shadow. Brooke felt it with every mile, the sense that victory was not a moment to be claimed, but a burden to be carried carefully, lest it crush those beneath it. The reports continued to pour in, gilded with phrases that glittered but did not always tell the truth. Patton's exploits filled columns and speeches. He had become a living symbol of the Allied advance. Brooke did not begrudge the man his fame. Patton was brilliant in his own ruthless way, but he could not help feeling the dull sting of erasure each time British achievements were folded neatly beneath the broader banner of American triumph. The alliance had saved Europe, yes, but it had also rewritten the map of pride. And Brooke knew, deep down, that when the guns finally fell silent, those distortions would calcify into history. In quieter hours, he would walk alone through the ruins of towns reclaimed from the enemy. He saw churches split in half, their bells melted into silence, and statues whose faces had been blown away by shell fire. He would stand in those empty squares, imagining the lives that had once filled them, the laughter, the markets, the quiet evenings before the world fell apart. Sometimes the locals recognized him. They did not know his name, only his uniform, and they would nod solemnly, murmuring words of thanks in a language he barely understood. Those moments reminded him that recognition did not have to come from headlines or medals. Sometimes it came from a single handshake, a shared look between survivors. Yet even so, the burden of representation weighed on him. Brooke had become not only a strategist, but a custodian of national dignity. He wrote constantly, memos, letters, journal entries, dispatches that blended military analysis with quiet reflections on character. In those pages, he preserved what could not be shouted, the patience, the discipline, the stubborn resilience of the British soldier. His writings were his rebellion against forgetfulness. He refused to let the noise of self-congratulation drown out the soft truth of endurance. When he met Churchill again in late September, the Prime Minister was more worn than Brooke had ever seen him. The man who had once stormed through meetings like a hurricane now moved slower, his voice lower, though his mind remained razor-sharp. They spoke not of strategy, but of legacy. Churchill admitted, with a tired smile, that perhaps history would always favour those who arrived late, but spoke loudly. The Americans had joined the war when Britain had already bled for years, and now they carried the fresh energy of saviours. It was natural, he said, for the world to look toward the new giant across the ocean. Brooke listened in silence, then answered that perhaps Britain's greatest victory was not in glory, but in endurance, that the nation had stood when the world collapsed, and that, in the end, endurance left deeper marks than triumph. Churchill's eyes softened at that, as though the words offered a truth he could accept. After that conversation, Brooke felt something shift in him. His resentment, while still sharp, began to dissolve into reflection. He realized that pride, like war, was a fire that could not burn forever. The soldiers he commanded did not fight for fame. They fought for each other, for home, for the simple right to rest without fear. They did not care whose name history remembered, only that the war would end. And so Brooke resolved to carry on, to lead without bitterness, to focus on the fragile machinery of alliance that had somehow held together under strain. By October, the fields had begun to turn brown again, the leaves curling in the chill wind. Brooke stood one morning, watching a convoy of supply trucks rumble east. The sky was vast and pale, the kind of sky that made men feel small and ancient. He thought of how fleeting all of it was. The power, the arguments, even the wars. One day the tanks would rust, the medals would fade, and the speeches would be forgotten. But the courage, the endurance, the quiet acts of grace under fire, those would remain, carried in the bloodlines of those who survived. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the sun was rising behind a smudge of smoke, and he felt a strange calm take root within him. Perhaps this, he thought, was what victory truly meant. Not the applause of nations, not the headlines or the statues, but the simple knowledge that one had done his duty with honesty when few others could see it. The truth did not need to shout. It only needed to endure. In that moment, Alan Brooke made peace with the silence history would assign him. He had spoken his truth to Churchill. He had defended the integrity of his men. And that, in the end, was enough. The war would continue, but his heart had found its measure. He walked back toward headquarters as the wind lifted his coat and scattered the first leaves of autumn across the road behind him, a trail of fleeting gold leading toward a horizon already claimed by the next storm of history. Winter crept in quietly, not with snow, but with a chill that settled in the bones and whispered of endings. The war's great tide was shifting. The Allied armies had crossed into lands that once seemed unreachable, and yet, the closer they drew to victory, the heavier the air became. It was the heaviness of exhaustion, of promises made to the dead, of the realization that triumph carried its own form of mourning. Alan Brooke watched it all unfold with the wary eyes of a man who had learned that the final act of war is never peace, but silence. By December, the frost clung to the edges of everything, the canvas tents, the barrels of guns, the corners of maps spread across command tables. Brooke's fingers, stiff from the cold, traced the front lines while reports arrived in endless waves. The Americans were pushing hard through the Ardennes, their audacity once again commanding headlines, while the British front held its long, patient vigil. The newspapers back home, both British and foreign, were filled with stories of bold offensives, daring breakthroughs, and legendary generals whose words thundered louder than artillery. Patton's name blazed across them like a banner. Brooke read those articles with detached calm, the anger long cooled into something quieter, something almost academic. He had already accepted that the narrative of this war was no longer his to control. But within the quiet of his mind, he carried a conviction as steady as the winter stars, that truth does not need to win, only to outlast. Churchill summoned him again to London as the year waned, the skies heavy with smoke from fires that refused to die even in peace. The city bore its scars proudly, craters filled with rainwater, half-collapsed buildings where pigeons nested, the faint hum of life rebuilding itself. The war officers were colder now, not from temperature, but from weariness. The corridors smelled of tobacco, wet wool, and history being written by those too tired to celebrate it. When Brooke entered Churchill's office, he found the Prime Minister gazing at a fire, his silhouette massive and motionless against the glow. The great man's voice was softer now, his words more measured, and when he spoke, Brooke felt not the booming oratory of wartime speeches, but the tremor of a soul that had spent itself entirely in service. They spoke of the war's approaching end, of Germany's last desperate spasms, of the post-war order that was already beginning to form like ice over still water. But beneath their conversation lay something unspoken, the memory of that earlier talk, the night when Patton's boast had sparked this long reflection on pride, truth, and alliance. Churchill confessed, almost wistfully, that he had learned to admire the Americans' vigor even as it unnerved him. They had brought a new rhythm to war, swift and relentless, and in that rhythm, the old British patience had seemed antiquated. Brooke replied that patience was not weakness, it was endurance, the kind that built civilizations rather than headlines. Churchill smiled faintly, the firelight dancing on his features. He said that perhaps history would remember men like Brooke not with glory, but with gratitude, and that, he thought, might be the greater honor. When Brooke left that night, The wind was sharp along Whitehall. He paused by the cenotaph, the monument standing silent under the pale moonlight, and removed his hat. Around him, London was quiet for the first time in years. He imagined the echoes of all the voices that would never return, and for a brief, unbearable moment, the city felt like a cathedral made of ghosts. He thought again of the young men in France, the ones who had fought without needing to be named. Their sacrifice was the true story, and no boast, however loud, could diminish it. He whispered a brief prayer, not to win, not to be remembered, but to remain worthy of them. Back at his quarters, Brooke sat at his desk and opened his journal. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, not from fatigue, but from the sheer enormity of what the past years had cost. He did not write about Patton anymore. That episode had become a symbol, not a grievance. Instead, he wrote about endurance, about the quiet strength of men who had fought without glory. He wrote about Churchill's loneliness, about the burden of leadership that no man could truly share. And he wrote about truth, the kind that does not arrive with trumpets, but waits patiently in the dark until the noise fades. Outside, the city lights flickered against the low clouds, and for the first time, Brooke felt the faint tremor of peace approaching. It would not be the peace of parades and banners. It would be the fragile, uncertain peace that comes when men realize they must live again. He closed his journal and stared out the window for a long while, thinking of the road ahead. He did not know if his name would ever be remembered beside those of louder men, but he knew that somewhere in the quiet pages of history, the truth of what he and his soldiers had done would survive. It might take years, decades even, but truth, he believed, had a memory longer than glory. And so, as the cold wind brushed against the glass, Alan Brooke allowed himself, for the first time in years, to breathe without the taste of battle in his lungs. The war was not yet over, but its echo was already receding. Soon, silence would return, and within that silence he knew, truth would finally have room to speak. The war ended not with a cheer, but with a long, collective exhale, a sound that rose across Europe like wind moving through the ruins of a broken cathedral. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Guns fell silent, soldiers blinked as if waking from a long fever, and the great machinery of destruction ground to a halt, leaving behind a world of mud, ghosts, and quiet disbelief. Alan Brooke stood at the edge of it all, watching as flags were raised over shattered towns, and as the men who had survived tried to remember how to walk without purpose. Victory, he thought, was a strange and fragile thing. It did not feel like triumph, only relief that the killing had finally stopped. The maps that had once dictated life and death now lay flat and irrelevant, their lines blurred by sweat and ash, headquarters emptied, convoys thinned, and the sky, once blackened by warplanes, seemed impossibly wide again. Brooke moved among the remnants of command, his uniform threadbare, his expression serene but distant. He was no longer the man who had stood in that tent months ago, bearing the weight of insult and pride. He had learned that wars are not truly won by those who shout the loudest, or even by those who command the most men, but by those who can endure, who can carry truth quietly through the storm without letting it die. Churchill summoned him one last time before the final conferences that would divide the spoils of peace. The Prime Minister's health was failing. His hands trembled slightly as he poured 2 glasses of brandy. The fire crackled between them, casting long shadows across the walls, and for a time they spoke of simple things. The rebuilding of cities, the families waiting at home, the uneasy peace taking shape beyond their reach. Then Churchill, in that gravel voice that had once held nations steady, said softly that he had been thinking of their first conversation, the night Brooke had told him of Patton's claim. He said he had realized since then that wars were never fought solely on the battlefield, that truth, like land, had to be defended too. He thanked Brooke not for his counsel, but for his silence, for having understood that sometimes restraint was the greater courage. Brooke said little in reply. He had never been a man of speeches. But he met Churchill's gaze and saw in it the reflection of all they had endured together, The doubt, the tension, the victories bought at unbearable cost. He raised his glass, and they drank without words. Two weary men bound by a shared understanding that history would never quite belong to them. It would belong to those who came later, those who would simplify, dramatize, distort. But the truth, the quiet, unglamorous truth, would remain between them like an unbroken oath. When Brooke left that night, London was washed in rain. The lights shimmered on the wet streets, and the city seemed to breathe again. He walked without direction, listening to the echo of his own footsteps, until he reached the river. The Thames moved slow and dark beneath the bridges, its surface rippling with reflected light. Brooke stood there for a long while, thinking of the men who had never come home, of the noise and confusion that had defined their lives, and of the silence that now held their memory. Somewhere in that silence, he thought, was the real story. The one no newspaper could write, the one no general could claim. He removed his hat, let the rain fall freely on his face, and whispered a few words into the night, though he could not later recall what they were. Perhaps they were a prayer, or perhaps they were simply a farewell, to the war, to the anger, to the burden of being right in a world that preferred the comfort of simple legends. Then he turned away from the river and began to walk home, his figure small against the vastness of the city, disappearing into the mist like a man at peace with the ghosts he carried. Years later, when history books would print their versions of those days, few would remember Alan Brooke beyond the footnotes. But somewhere in the quiet between lines, the truth would still hum faintly, that once, in a dim tent under a trembling lantern, one man had told another that victory meant nothing if honesty was lost. And though the world moved on, that whisper, that single moment of integrity, would outlast the roar of any triumph. So if this story reached you, if these words carried something of that silence, that endurance, that fragile truth, then let it linger with you, like the echo of a fading bugle at dusk. It asks only that you remember. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe that the quiet stories still matter.